less than 48 hours before finishing, the critical objective of this COP is right now an empty placeholder. There is not a clear quantum defined by donors. So we are negotiating on nothing.
Stalemate in Baku, Azerbaijan, as negotiators race to strike a deal at the UN Climate Change Conference. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. There are deep divisions at COP29, the UN climate conference, over the amount wealthy nations should pay developing countries to fight climate change and mitigate its impact. Industrialized nations are offering a few $100 billion, but the developing world says it needs $1.3 trillion. Negotiators are tasked with closing the gap, but the deadline is fast approaching. So there is much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Changhua chairs the Asia-Pacific Water Forum's Governing Council. Mahmoud is an expert in water management and climate adaptation. Also with us is Amali. She's the founder and executive director of Climate Refugees. And Michael K. Dorsey heads Arizona State University's Walton Sustainability Solutions Service. Thanks to all of you. Michael Dorsey, this has been dubbed the Finance COP. Negotiators are trying to bridge that gap on climate finance, but the draft was also roundly denounced for failing to include a key provision on how much wealthy nations should pay to developing countries. So that's a big gap there. How is it resolved?
It's not yet being resolved. Really, the commitments from the richest countries in the world, the United States, those in Europe, Australia, falls considerably short of what's really needed. Since we were at the negotiations last year in Dubai, countries have assembled roughly several $100 million worth of pledges, when really what is truly needed is really the trillions that you talked about, but really at least in the hundreds of billions. And that difference may seem insignificant or incomprehensible to some of the listeners, but imagine having a vacation where you needed to put a couple $1,000s down and you showed up at the travel agency with $1 or even less. It's just not fit for purpose. And that's the gaps that we're talking about. We're talking about 10,000 or 1,000 times the pledges versus what's truly needed to get out ahead of this problem. And it's something that the rich countries of the world are going to have to lean into and more aggressively support those poorest countries where we see the climate crisis unfolding catastrophically and impacting those on the margins of society, especially in the global south.
Michael, the climate conference was also divided on another issue, and that was reaffirming the pledge to transition away from fossil fuels. Let's listen to the OPEC Secretary General, Hatem Al-Ghais. Let's watch.
Today, petroleum and petroleum-derived products continue to shape how we heat and cool our homes, construct our buildings, and transport ourselves from A to B. Oil and gas remain vital to producers and consumers around the world. As His Excellency Azerbaijan's President, His Excellency Ilham Aliyev, emphasized at the opening of COP29, they are indeed a gift of God.
So, Michael, here we have, the Secretary General of OPEC talking there about the importance of fossil fuels at a conference where delegates were discussing how to mitigate the impacts of climate change. What do you make of that?
Well, it's unfortunate language that the president of Azerbaijan chose, and those that are following him have chosen to sort of echo. I think the Secretary General said it best, that it was a kind of a farce to offer up such comparisons that, fossil fuels are a gift of God. And really, I turn to those, from the faith space, Reverend Fletcher Harper, for example, he called it obscene, as did many other people of faith. And it really obscene to offer that which is destroying not just the planet and ecosystems, but whole communities would be an act, a gift from God. Nothing could be further from the truth. We have tons of science that leads us to this conclusion. So it's disappointing to hear a sitting world leader offer up such what can only be called nonsense.
Changhua, we've been talking about this for months, for years, in fact, and it seems that, the climate crisis has really escalated. I mean, we see the loss of lives, the loss of livelihoods due to floods, wildfires, as well as rising seas. This conference in Azerbaijan was an opportunity for world leaders to signal their commitment to making good on pledges that they have made in the past. Do you see any progress at all?
Barely anything. Only a couple of countries like Azerbaijan itself, UK, and Brazil. A few countries decided to put on the table their commitments for the next NDCs at this moment. The deadline globally is next February, so we still have a couple of months to go. But now the focus in Baku, COP29, it was mostly focusing on the financing number. So climate finance, as we all know it, is not just isolated by a number or few numbers there. Rather, it's going to be linked, connected with the commitments we're going to look into the future in the coming decade there, because the finance money goes somewhere, needs to be invested and spent somewhere in order to deliver the desired acceleration of clean energy transition as well as adaptation. So that's pretty much the current saga we are stuck in at this moment. So fingers crossed, hopefully countries will come forward with more clarity on their commitment for the coming decade in terms of climate actions. But now at this very moment, let's really address the money issue first, because without that, the global multilateral process will be stuck. There is a risk of collapsing, the international process. There's not many people want to see that. So that's where we stand today.
Right, Changhua, the fact that it is so difficult to get agreement on financing, is that a signal that possibly there are countries in the world, developed countries in the world, that don't recognize the seriousness of the challenge that we face right now?
Not really. I think climate change is everywhere, and we're all living in it. At the end of the day, I think it's somehow stuck in the political landscape there. If you look at the US presidential outcome result there, and that's the most worrying piece of the puzzle in the global collective action fighting climate change there. So it's more like about whether developed countries should take on their responsibility and deliver their commitment to provide financial support for poor developing countries on one side to mitigate the climate change, but in the meantime to really adapt. There was some limited progress made so far in Baku. For instance, the first day of the negotiation, countries' representatives agreed to move forward with the carbon market, which has been controversial for about a decade or so. At least we started to somehow have some green lights, so hopefully somehow that will help mobilize some money. But in the meantime, if you look at the loss and damage fund, which also made some progress, I think so far we have about $750 million committed by developed countries. But really the biggest piece of the puzzle is really the overall package, something called NCQG, which is called New Collective Quantified Goal, which is the #1 goal of the COP29 this year. But somehow that's where we are stuck, because so far there is not a solid number in the current draft so far. And hopefully somehow at this very winning hours actually of the negotiation, which is postponed already, we'll be able to have something meaningful, at least the number of climate finance, particularly from public sources.
Mahmoud, let's look at the role that oceans play in this challenge, this climate change challenge that we're talking about. It's not something we talk about very often, but the ocean has absorbed 90% of excess energy, but the absorption of that excess carbon dioxide that we're talking about is making oceans more acidic and affects marine life as well. Now, delegates at COP29 did discuss marine carbon removal and ocean finance as well. What can you tell us about this?
Well, in COP, that is unfortunately mired with a lack of progress based on what we've heard so far. There are some small incremental progresses, and I think, as you alluded to, there are some commitments in terms of projects and efforts towards moving the conservation protection of oceans higher up in the agenda to address both the warming issue, which is affecting marine life, acidification, and of course, long-standing issue, pollution of those waters. One thing to also consider why this is of importance beyond just, of course, from an ecological and environmental perspective, think about all these developing nations we reference quite frequently when we talk about climate change, especially those island nations. some of their economies are built on the oceans that surround them, whether we think in terms of fishing, whether we think in terms of boating, navigation, transportation. This is not just an issue that feels right to address, but even in terms of socioeconomic conditions, those island nations are also affected. And that's not even touching the fact that the biggest impact affecting the oceans because of warming that affects those particular places is this creeping sea level rise that, as of now, we have no way to halt, absent serious mitigation of emissions that affects both the atmosphere and the oceans.
So, Mohammed, you were saying at the beginning there of your answer that this is a conference that was mired in very little progress. And what were your main takeaways?
There's so much to unpack of what's happening, or more accurately, what's not happening. I'm getting a very strange sense of deja vu of at least the COP in Glasgow and the COP in Egypt, where in the 11th hour, nations and negotiators are fighting to scrape out a deal. And in both cases, it took a very long time. In the case of Glasgow, the Glasgow Pact was almost an ineffectual treaty, just signaling desires of nations to do better. I'm getting a sense that we're going to end up the same way here because the funding is inadequate, the target is inadequate in terms of what is needed, and 1 trillion can be pulled together. It seems like a lot of money, as Michael has indicated. That's about 1% of the global economy. It can absolutely, developing nations can put it together. But it almost feels, what's more concerning to me is not just that we're having a hard time getting a deal together, like those 2 previous COPs we talked about, but it almost feels like we're moving backwards. Not only are we having a hard time committing to the funds that were already established in COP28, but we're also having a hard time agreeing to the language that came out of COP28, as was mentioned, in terms of commitment to transition away from fossil fuels. And in a strange way, I would say this actually meets expectations or lack of expectations. I think coming out of COP28, and a lot of people are looking towards COP30 in Brazil, the environmental COP, Baku was a stopover. And expectations were low, but I don't think many people anticipated to have this level of lack of progress and regression almost in between COP28 and COP30.
Amali, great to see you. The World Bank says that by 2050, 216 million people could be forced to move, and that's because of water scarcity as well as lower crop yields and rising sea levels. Add to that the fact that people have to move, are forcibly moving because of conflict around the globe, other types of violence as well. We see drug-related violence in some parts of the world that's forcing people to move as well. Can you give us a sense of how dire this situation is?
It's extremely dire, and it's dire in all parts of the world. And I think, as we've been hearing, my fellow panelists say, we seem to have a disconnect with not understanding how serious it is. And although impacts are felt everywhere, it seems like the lack of a number that can meet the rising needs for mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and a fair and just transition just doesn't meet the seriousness of the needs that are right now. For example, drought displacement is impacting like 51% of grazing lands, leads to that kind of displacement. So the most vulnerable places in the world are, Africa, for example, where there's already major refugee populations, and countries that are hosting refugees are dealing with internal displacement of their own citizens. You're having the people that are the poorest and the most marginalized having to be forced to migrate instead of using migration as a means of adaptation to climate change. There's also very little input that these stakeholders, these people who really are both the victims and then being forced to survive the effects of the climate crisis, have had very little say in shifting the conversation, in getting the impacts felt and heard at the COP stage. So it's incredibly serious, Anand, and it's refugees, migrants, and the most marginalized people on the planet that are paying the price right now.
Michael Dorsey, there was a UN panel that said that carbon markets are essential for achieving net zero by 2050. There has been a deal. Carbon markets in the Middle East and in North Africa will now be open to international buyers. In layman's terms, what does that mean for the globe, for the planet?
Well, you know, we've got 2 decades of essentially poorly delivering carbon markets. The short story for them is that marketplace is more akin to sort of the junk bond space in the climate financial world, I would say. We haven't seen those markets scale and scale up over the 2 decades that people have been assembling them. We haven't seen them deliver big results. I think you're going to see much more, and you're seeing much more development in the growth of clean energy, and the financing of renewables, particularly solar and wind, than you are in the sort of the marginal space of the carbon markets. The short story is that you'll have people that are doing offsets to offset emissions projects and so forth, and investing very relatively small amounts into those markets because they're in the sort of, you know, tens of billions of dollars as opposed to the multi-trillion dollars that we see in the renewable energy space. That's really the future, is the growth in the renewable energy area, not in the carbon markets. It's marginal, it's important, it's a signal, but definitely not enough.
Changhua, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he said that failure on climate finance at COP29 is, quote, not an option. But looking at the very slow progress that has been made on this particular issue, is there a plan B? I mean, if there's no agreement, what then?
Honestly, I don't think there is a plan B. And at all, if we all honor the multilateral global climate governance mechanisms, which has been already established, we've been operating that for more than 3 decades already. We need to stick to the fundamental principles. We need all the parties need to honor their commitments. We've made many commitments already over the years, every COP. Just look at all the documents there. In particular, in that context, it's the money. And that has turned out to be one of the most difficult, challenging piece of the puzzle in advancing the global multilateral climate governance process there. And so as we're all talking about here today, on one side, of course, we need to reduce emissions as quickly as possible. Nowhere near that. And, you know, according to the plan, by 2030, and global, emissions should be down by at least maybe 43–45% over the current level. And even last year, we are now seeing rising emissions, 0.8% emissions there already. If you look at adaptation, the intensifying climate crisis, if you look at the losses and the damages, and if you look at the destruction to lives, livelihoods, and the nature, and the cost is beyond anyone's imagination there. So we sort of understand the challenges. We started to put the numbers together in order to really accelerate the financing, actually, the acceleration of transition. We have solutions, but somehow we are still stuck in the current sort of landscape of the politics. And they are saying, say, developed countries cannot really put the money on the table requested by developing countries because, one, inflation, the second one, the pandemic, and the third one, because of conflicts like in Ukraine. Just imagining other countries, poor countries, are suffering even more so. And so we do need to get a clear mind coming to the table, reach agreement as soon as possible, nudging the process forward rather than going back to ground zero.
Mohammed, Mahmoud, there are some analysts who say that it's highly unlikely that there will be a deal on financing or ocean climate solutions. But there is a focus on what's known as nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. 73% of coastal and island nations have included at least one ocean-based climate action, like building offshore wind farms, for instance. But what more needs to be done?
A lot more. I mean, this is sort of the theme of everything we've been saying. And I want to put something in perspective here. We've been focusing, and I should accurately say the COP has been focusing on issues related to financing, right? And then also, as you had mentioned, issues related to treaties and pacts, of which I'd roll under there this idea of NDCs, right? Every country puts forth their plan, their commitment, their framework to potentially phasing down or transitioning down or cutting down their emissions and moving towards a future where those emissions are slashed down. But one thing I want to make very perfectly clear, those two elements in terms of financing and agreements to reduce emissions and address the climate crisis that way are the very preliminary steps towards actually getting to a future where we have improvements, reductions in impacts of climate change and reduced emissions.
Yeah.
Because once you get the financing, once you get the agreements, there has to be execution. And that's not a sort of a team sport as the COP produces to be. It's a political process. But until we can't get past this very, I believe, preliminary step, we can't begin to execute these plans and actions and put the money into play to actually bend the curve in terms of future warming.
Right. Amali Tower, at COP29, the UN Refugee Agency unveiled Refugees for Climate Action Network. It brings together 8 forcibly displaced people from across the world. What can you tell us about this, and where do you see its benefits?
It's an extremely great development. As I said earlier, there's been an alarming lack of representation of stakeholders and people who I would say are on the front lines of this crisis every single day. One of the barriers too have been, actually getting people to these forums is even difficult in the face of like what refugees and migrants face every day, which is, visas. Visas can be a barrier to even have the people who can influence negotiations, who should influence negotiations through storytelling, through being able to express how, if you're a refugee, even from conflict, why are you now facing secondary displacement? Why are you facing even more hardship, even in refugee camp situations, which is what I hear in my work every single day, where children can't even go to the schools that the UN might run because of desertification, because of rising temperatures. These are stories that need to be heard in these forums. So I think it's a really great development. And I think kudos to my colleagues for finding ways to get around these barriers I mentioned, like the lack of funding, the lack of opportunities, the lack of visas that allow people who are displaced folks to be there. But I want to say, Anand, it's not just refugees and migrants also, right? You have to think about how is migration happening in all its means in the era of the climate crisis? So when we talk about just transition, for example, what about labor migration pathways? Are they fair? Is this representative of how migrants are being affected? People in the Sundarbans, for example, who might be getting into great deals of debt because of failed crops. They're trapped in a cycle of debt. Then they go off into labor migration schemes that end up being quite exploitative. These are also stories that need to be heard at forums like the COP. So I think storytelling is incredibly important. And one last thing I'll say is, organizations like mine, like Climate Refugees, and many of my peers, we've been providing case studies, for example, to the board that is, responding, the fund for responding to loss and damage, to express what are the needs, how are refugees, migrants, displaced populations, affected populations dealing with the climate crisis, and how can loss and damage finance be made accessible at the community level directly to the most impacted people.
Okay, Changhua, well, I want to talk about the Chinese efforts. We've seen a lot from China in moving to a green economy. Now, as there is consensus on climate finance, or rather consensus remaining very elusive, China has come into focus for its contributions to green technologies. And since 2016, China has provided and mobilized funds for its green transition and development to the tune of $24.5 billion. And its initiatives include the development and transfer of technology, skills, and knowledge. Let's look at this report here from our reporter Radhika Bajaj. She reports from Baku.
As the urgency for climate action escalates, China is proving to be a crucial ally for developing nations. Through groundbreaking technology and strategic investments, it's helping countries transition to a greener future, all while keeping affordability and efficiency in check.
In China, up to 27% of solar-generated energy can be transitioned and commercialized. This is the highest efficiency level in the world, and it's also affordable. It's a similar story for EVs in China. The manufacturing cost of EVs is 40% lower than European production. This is owed to technological innovation and intense market competition in China.
China dominates the global solar energy sector, producing nearly 80% of the world's solar panels. The International Energy Agency says China built more solar panels in 2023 than the entire world combined in 2022. And this progress is not just limited at home.
So the Bahawalpur National Park, the solar park of 1,000 megawatts, was established with Chinese collaboration, and for that we are grateful to the Chinese government, and we are moving towards more cleaner and greener energy.
We have now a very robust cooperation between Nigeria and China. Recently we were invited to Beijing, where we had discussion on the area of solar belt in Nigeria. We are also looking at trying to tap from China in doing our green industrialization in Nigeria. But the most important that we are looking at is the issue of clean energy.
Developed countries have also benefited from China's ability to provide green transition solutions at scale. But the impact is felt most in the developing world, where the contributions help bridge the gap between ambition and action in the fight against climate change. At COP29 in Baku, China has asked the rich developed countries to raise their contributions towards updated climate finance targets, in the hope that global cooperation can create a greener, more equitable world for all. Radhika Bajaj, CGTN, Baku, Azerbaijan.
So, Changhua, at COP29, China announced very ambitious plans to expand its renewable energy capacity. Could you give us some idea of the progress that China has made?
Sure. I think two ways of looking at China's role at the COP29 at this moment. On one side is really China's dedicated to delivery of tripling its renewable energy by 2030, and as committed last year at the COP29, 28th. And it's not just to say the numbers. You have to invest in technology, industrial, value chain build up, policy incentive to deploy. China has made a strong case that's doable. On the other side, as mentioned, and China has been providing financing, climate financing, to working with other developing countries to accelerate the clean energy transition, not only with the money on the table, but also expertise and also collaboration. And that needs to be recognized as China's contribution to the global positive tipping points for clean energy transition.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.